Welcome, Alex. Thank you so much for being here and joining us to talk about this very important topic.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
It is a pleasure. Do you want to start by telling us a little bit about what brought you to this incredible body of work that you have in this global practice that you have, what your professional background is, and also personally what engaged your heart in this work?
Yeah, sure. So what I should say to start, I didn't sit there in a career planning meeting in my teenage years going, right, I'm going to become an expert in fatigue and trauma and these various areas. Like a lot of people that work in these spaces, I was drawn through my own personal experience. I suffered from ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, as a teenager, which was a very scary and difficult experience, I think, at any point, but particularly in your teenage years, when I sort of defined myself by sport and being able to playing in bands and all these things that I loved. And I basically spent 7 years on this incredibly difficult journey. And the first couple of years of that was just waiting for somebody else to find the answers. And then I spent 5 years on this very determined and probably in hindsight a bit too determined at times, but very committed healing path. And that was my initial kind of baptism, let's say, into working with psychology and nutrition and kind of integrative medicine, let's say. But my real interest in trauma, in terms of the context of particularly this conversation, is that I found myself in my mid-20s having been through this chronic fatigue healing journey and set up the organization that I still run, the Optimum Health Clinic, which now has patients in 50 countries around the world and has had a big impact. But I started that when I was 23 years old. And
wow.
at the time, I don't recommend it. I made every possible mistake along the way. But at the time, I had this enormous success in these early years. And in my mid-20s, I sort of had everything that I thought I wanted. I had this very successful practice. I lived in this very nice penthouse apartment in London, and I had this fancy car, and I was dating these glamorous women. The problem was, on the outside, it all looked great. I'd been on this kind of healing journey, and I'd learned a lot about psychology and so on. But on the inside, I was an absolute mess. I was having debilitating anxiety and panic attacks. I couldn't have a relationship longer than a few months, and I was always convinced it was the other person that was the problem. And then at some point, I was like, but there is one common denominator between all of these relationships, and it does seem to be me. And so I found myself in this very difficult place where I knew a lot of things, and I was working as a psychology practitioner. I was very successful as a psychology practitioner, but my own life wasn't where I wanted it to be. And what I came to realize was I simply hadn't addressed my own childhood trauma. And trauma is a word that I think is thrown around a lot these days. It's probably worth just saying that I mean trauma in quite a broad definition of trauma. There's what we could call kind of big T traumas, like physical abuse, sexual abuse, perhaps as a child, or being in a major car accident, or having major surgery. But there are also what we call small T traumas, like these more subtle developmental traumas where we don't perhaps get our emotional needs met. We don't get the sense of safety that we need. One of the major traumas in my childhood was that my mother left my father soon after I was born and divorced on grounds of mental cruelty. We never saw my father again. And so I grew up without my father. And, it's one of those things that you think you're not missing something because you haven't had it. And if you'd said to me, has it impacted you? I'd be like, well, what do you mean? Like, I haven't got a father. And it was only when I really started working on myself that I realized that fathers are not optional. Not having a parent has a major impact. And so here I was in my mid-20s, and I was starting to figure these things out. And I was on a week-long retreat, which was all about going into our unprocessed emotional pain. And I was terrified. And I remember multiple times planning my departure, like, how do I get in the car and go home in a way that doesn't look like I'm running away? Of course, I wanted to run away. And really had this moment where I realized that I had two choices available to me. The first choice was that I could carry on running and using the strategies that I was used to using of avoidance, and we'll come into this, I'm sure, in a bit, avoidance and distraction and analyzing my feelings and not really feeling them. Or I could take a leap and I could start to really open to my emotions, the place that I hadn't really fully gone. And it was enormously scary. But I was, with the right support and with a little dose of courage, was able to really start to open to. And I had this experience of just all the pent up hatred and rage towards my father. Like I wanted to murder and kill my father in that moment. So then feeling this incredibly deep longing and sadness and sort of desolation and desperation of longing to have the contact with my father. And on the other side of this, it's not like you process all of your unprocessed emotions in an hour therapy session, but something was fundamentally different in my relationship to my feelings and emotions. And I spent the next 6 months, basically most of the time, just really angry. It's like all these years of anger that hadn't been felt. And, you know, I was dealing with that by doing these really intense gym sessions, and I kept pulling muscles because I was just so kind of pent up in this rage. And then something popped, and I spent the next 6 months just feeling desperately sad. And I kind of went from the gym to doing yoga, and I'd lie in shavasana at the end of yoga classes, crying and hoping no one could see that I was crying. And there was this big process of metabolizing and processing and digesting. And on the other side of that, I stopped having the panic attacks. I met quite soon after that my wife. I've been together 11 years. We have 3 kids. And what I realized was so much of the suffering that we experience in our lives is all the things we do to try and get away from the feelings and the emotions that we've not processed and we've not dealt with. And for many people on their health journeys, it's a piece of the jigsaw. Some people, it's the biggest piece of the jigsaw. Some people, it's a small piece of the jigsaw. Many of us on our journey to deeper intimacy in relationships, it's really important because we can't be truly intimate and connected to someone if we're trying to hide all these parts of ourselves that we're ashamed of or we haven't dealt with and we haven't processed. So I've become increasingly in recent years try to become a strong voice in this idea that ultimately you can't heal what you don't feel, and learning to feel and metabolize our emotions is one of the most important things that we can learn to do in our lives.
Super powerful. I completely concur. I'm in a totally different path, but 23, 24 years into a personal growth, spiritual, conscious living journey, the last couple of years has been uber clear that emotional awareness and emotional processing are like everything, because anything else in isolation without that is like the energy is all blocked up and it's a constant holding on, right? And I really liked how something you said before was to the effect, it's not the difficult emotions, it's the avoidance of the difficult emotions that is actually the void and the running away from that is creating so much of the problem. So can you talk about, you mentioned in some of your work that there's a big consequence of emotional trauma and people being emotionally disconnected. So some people will be listening to this and they'll be like, okay, I'm here to learn about you being emotionally connected, but they're not putting together necessarily that perhaps there's emotional trauma and emotional disconnection as the consequence of it. And for some people they might be unaware of, like you said, unaware of having had a trauma that would make them now as an adult feel emotionally disconnected.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say is that emotional connection is our natural state. So if you look at babies, they don't have a judgment about crying or being angry or being like, that's our natural state, is to be emotional. Now, is that to say we should all regress back to a baby's relationship style? Probably not, because there are certain limits and parameters and ways that one learns to kind of moderate their emotions in appropriate ways. But when we have emotional overwhelm, when there is too much happening and we don't know, we can't deal with it, or particularly if we have primary caregivers that don't welcome and allow us to have our feelings and emotions, those emotions don't just disappear. They have to go somewhere, or put another way, we have to go somewhere. So one of the things that tends to happen is when we have a lot of emotion that's not held, that's not welcome, that's not supported, we disconnect. And one of the ways we disconnect is we go into our mind. I talk about a safety cycle where we feel unsafe in our body. So our mind speeds up, because if we can try and think our way to a feeling of safety, like if this happens, I'll do that. And there's kind of constant hypervigilant state, which is really the origin of a lot of the anxiety that people experience, that we just have got learned to be in this over thinking way of being. But as we try to think our way to a feeling of safety, we get even more disconnected. So we feel even more unsafe. So the pattern gets even more energy to it. The feeling of safety that we're seeking is in our body. It's not in our mind. There has to be a slowing down. There has to be a deepening of connection to ourself for that feeling of safety then to arise. And so one of the things that happens when we have emotional overwhelm, or which is another way of talking about trauma, we learn to disconnect. And we don't do it because we're dysfunctional or because there's something wrong with us. We do it to survive. Like there's amazing wisdom and brilliance in these responses. The problem is that the thing that kept us safe, the walls that we put up to keep us safe as a child, can become the prison as an adult. As children, we really have three fundamental needs. We have the need of love, to feel loved, to feel adored, to feel special in the eyes of our parents. And that isn't a want, it's for healthy emotional development. It's a need that we have. We also have the need to feel safe, to feel physically safe, to feel emotionally safe. One of the things that gives us that feeling of safety is being physically held and co-regulating our nervous system with our, often it's our mother, but it could be our father or a grandparent. If the person which is holding us is they themselves is anxious and stressed, that's what we're regulating. Our system is actually being trained to feel unsafe. So we have the need for love. We have the need for safety. We also have the need for healthy boundaries. That's where someone might say no in a loving and holding way, but they keep us safe. Another example might be a parent says, "You've got this. You can do this." And that traditionally, although of course these roles evolve in all kinds of ways, traditionally was more the father role, like mother saying, "Get down from that tree, you're going to hurt yourself." And the more father role saying, "No, go higher, you can do this." And to have self-esteem and self-confidence in the world, we need to have that voice that says, "You've got it, go for it." So when we don't have that sense of love and holding, we don't have that sense of safety, or we don't have that sense of boundary and that sense of strength that's given to us, the world is a very difficult place. And when we feel emotions and we don't feel safe, we're not safe to feel those emotions. Or we have this need for love and we're not getting the love that we need, and we feel angry about that, or we feel hurt about that. But if we feel that, we might be rejected, or someone might walk away. So we have all of these feelings, like going back to, for example, my story, that having a parent that basically just walks out and abandons you. There's all kinds of feelings a child's going to have. A sense of rage and anger, a sense, as I talked about, a sense of sadness, a sense of maybe I'm just not lovable because why did this person not hang around? As small children, it's just too much. So we develop these different strategies, these different ways of responding to all of these feelings and emotions that help us survive, that help us navigate these difficult experiences. And I also want to make the distinction between, we can have parents that love us, but are unskillful. And as a result, still develop these strategies. Like, we can know that we're loved and not feel that we're loved. We can, I can look back on, I know my mum loved me and my mum loves me. And my mum wasn't a very skillful parent, and part of the reason being my mum worked 3 jobs because she had to support 2 children financially, that she had her own sense of guilt and her own sense of grief of the loss of her marriage, her own trauma that came from that, her own domineering mother. So she loved her children. She would have done, in fact, it's funny, I was doing a session. I was interviewing Gabor Mate or something on Sunday, and I think he put it really well. He said, I realized, I would have done anything for my children. I would have thrown myself into a fire for my children. But what my children wanted was for me to be loving and to be present. And I said to him, throwing yourself in the fire is easier though, isn't it? We both laughed, because it's like being loving and being present and attentive is not an easy thing to do. Yeah. So we can have parents that love us. We can have parents that are not terrible human beings, but they don't have the skills. They don't know how to co-regulate. They don't know how to give healthy boundaries. They don't know how to be present with their attention. And as a result, we may not have an awful childhood, but we have an impactful childhood that shapes these patterns. And then these patterns go from being survival strategies in childhood to traits, to habits, to ways of living in the world as adults.
Walking around in adult bodies with children running the show inside of us. And like you say, they're appropriate coping strategies when we're children, but they're outdated programs as adults, right? And I do like how you described, it's very, very clear that it's almost impossible to get out of your childhood without a little of this happening, which would help people that are probably rationalizing with themselves. Why am I like this? Why do I feel like this? Because I had great parents, because nothing happened to me. I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't be this way. But a lot of us grew up in a generation where it's like kids seen, not heard. There's an immediate shutdown of big feelings, right? And I love the conscious parenting movement, aware parenting now, which is like all feelings are welcome, which is loud and noisy and intense and takes presence and time, but it's a really, really powerful shift in the way that kids are dealt with. But also, for parents listening who are thinking, oh gosh, I'm a parent and I'm doing this to my child, which I hear quite a lot. Our parents were just children who grew up in the same way, right? We're just, if we've got kids, parents who grew up in that way. And so it's a breaking of the cycle, right? I think there's an awesome opportunity on the planet happening right now for our generation and the generations that are coming for a different experience for children growing up. But do you want to talk about these 6 styles of emotional disconnection so people can understand how that might be playing out? And by the way, if people are listening and just going, yeah, I am all of this, there are solutions coming, because Alex has got an amazing body of work, but there's a live conference happening. I know you've got books, you have so many awesome things. So we'll make sure people are up with the goodness.
Yeah, and B, just before we come to the emotional styles, I just want to respond to something you said, because I think it's important that each generation does its best to improve on a generation before, right? And we don't get it right, we don't do it perfectly, but just that very intention is an act of love, right? I think there's so much that's wonderful about the conscious parenting movement. And if I may be as bold as to say, I sometimes fear that the pendulum has to swings a bit too far to find its point of balance. Like, it's gone from very rigid boundaries, like, if a baby cries and it's not feeding time for an hour, leave them crying, which is an overly rigid boundary, to then I'm going to have no boundaries. I just want my child to feel completely adored and completely loved. The problem is that some of those kids, which are now in their sort of 20s and have grown up in this very spacious, loving environment, what I observe is they actually, sometimes, not always, but sometimes what they struggle with is being able to get themselves to commit to things and discipline to things, because they didn't have those firm boundaries that said, this is the edge. I know you don't want to do your piano practice or do this or do that, but you made a commitment that, no, I'm not imposing this, but you made a commitment that you wanted to get to this point. This is the price of entry to get to that point. And so a lot of the things we may want to do in the world are hard. They take the ability to commit to things and be disciplined and be determined. And boundaries as a child helps us learn that. So it's a sort of interesting thing that it's like the breakthrough at one stage becomes the limitation at the next stage. It's like it's a breakthrough of, I'm not going to give boundaries, to go, oh, actually, boundaries are really helpful, but they need to be sensitive boundaries, and boundaries that actually respond to the child, not just crush their will and impose an outside authority. So it's like, it's difficult, this stuff, right?
I think it's that pendulum swinging is very much like what we do in our own personal growth and healing journey. Sometimes we go one way or the other way until we find the this middle way, the middle path, the balance.
You know, it's like when I was on my chronic fatigue healing journey, and having been so failed by the standard kind of medical system, I went for a point, I was like, I'm never going to see a doctor again. It's all terrible. It's all awful. And that was a necessary thing at the time to really find my path with some different ways of doing things. And if at any point along that way I'd been run over by a bus, I'm pretty sure I would have wanted the painkillers and the surgery, not the Reiki practitioner and the nutritionist. So it's like, sometimes we have to swing, and it's trying to find that really balanced and measured perspective. And sometimes with parenting, in my experience, and I'm certainly no expert on parenting, but often it's quite a boring middle road. But it's really trying to be attentive and be thoughtful of one's choices, not just impulsive or swing to an extreme. Anyway, I digress. So coming to,
I could talk about that. I could talk to you for hours and hours. Your body of work is just so fascinating. I'm going to keep on track, but there's so many things that you've created into the world, and I'm just like on point. It's so good.
So you asked me about the emotional style. So to come to that, this is a model which is part of our therapeutic coaching methodology, which is a training program which we train therapists in, of bringing key elements from traditional psychotherapeutic approaches with a more solution-based coaching methodology. And really what it's looking at is, with everything we've been talking about so far, we have these overwhelming feelings as a child and we don't know how to handle them, so we have to disconnect. There are different strategies. There are different ways that we learn to do that. And there are different reasons why people might develop different strategies. And to preempt a question, some people do all of these strategies. Some people do one or two. We sometimes have preferred strategies at different stages in our lives. But the first one is avoidance and distraction. This is where we've got feelings, emotions that are going on, but we're always a bit too busy to feel them. And avoidance and distraction could be being driven, always having projects on the go, and as soon as you finish one thing, starting 3 more things. It could be more subtle, like just always having the radio on in the background because you don't want to have that silence that might mean you start to feel things, to always being on 3 devices at once, like you've got the TV on whilst you're on your laptop, whilst you're sending WhatsApps on your phone, like just always having a lot of stimulation, which stops us from feeling. We're avoiding because we're always looking for stuff, or we're distracting, like our attention is always pulled in different places. The second emotional style is state changing. This is where we might use drugs, we might use alcohol, we might use sex, we might use food, we might use exercise, but anything that we're using to change the emotions that we're feeling. I think a really good example of this is the Elton John biopic Rocket Man, where it shows some of his kind of childhood journey, and you really see that at the heart of a lot of it was this going back to these 3 emotional needs, this longing to be loved and be seen by his family that's not being met. And so this constant use of fame and drugs and sex of ways to try and change those feelings. And the state changing strategies might be enormously obvious and destructive that someone's got a major problem with, like drugs and alcohol, or it could be quite subtle. It could just be that whenever we feel something we don't like, we reach for something. One moment it might be food. The next moment it might be I'm going to go and do a really intense workout. The next moment it might be I'm going to go out and have too many drinks with friends. And it's not necessarily that any of these things are wrong, by the way. Like numbing out watching Netflix is sometimes the best self-care that one can have. It's when we use these things in a dependent, unhealthy way. So there's avoidance and distraction, there's state changing. The third emotional style is analyzing. This is where we're too much in our head and not enough in our emotions. And this was particularly me before the experiences that I described a little bit earlier. People assumed that I was emotionally really quite literate. I was very good. I'd written a whole book about my emotional healing journey. I was very good at talking about my emotions and analyzing my emotions. I just wasn't feeling my emotions. So analyzing is sometimes a way of appearing to be in contact, but it's in an analytical way, not in a true felt way. The fourth emotional style is blaming others. It's like I feel hurt, and I feel hurt because it's your fault because you did that thing. Now, there may or may not be truth in the fact that the person needs to be held accountable for something. But by being in a blame reaction, it's often a way of not truly feeling how we feel because we're too busy in the blame and not enough in the feeling. So this might look like someone who's emotionally perhaps quite volatile, but it's always someone else's fault that they're volatile. The result is they don't truly get to feel, to digest, and to heal those emotions. The fifth emotional style is the empath. This is where we feel everyone else's emotions. So particularly as an empath, we cannot really know how we feel. We may be feeling loads of stuff, but it's actually everyone else's stuff. And that can become very overwhelming. It can be often a strategy that's developed as a child where we were sort of either spouseified by our parents, like we became the surrogate husband or wife, or we had to become the adult because our parent was in the kind of child role. And we've learned to be empathic and feel, and it can also be a strategy we learned that we had unpredictable parents and volatile parents. And by empathizing, we could keep ourselves safe because we could feel into how they were feeling. Then we could position our behavior to try and keep ourselves safe in response to that. The sixth emotional style is somatizing. This is where we feel our emotions as physical symptoms. So, for example, we get angry, but we don't feel the anger, so we get a headache. Or we get worried about something, but we don't feel the worry, we get an upset tummy. Or we get frustrated about something and we get lower back pain. And so our emotions are manifesting effectively as physical symptoms. So just to quickly summarize, there's avoidance and distraction. This is where that we are constantly looking for ways to get away from feeling our feelings. Second is state changing, could be sex, drugs, alcohol, food, but ways effectively, I don't like the feeling I have, so I'm going to find a way to change that feeling rather than feel that feeling. Analyzing, we're in our head, we might be thinking about our feelings, we might be thinking about something completely different, but we're analyzing rather than feeling. The fourth is we're blaming others. I have this emotion, but it's your fault that I have this emotion. Therefore, I don't really need to sit with it and be with it. The fifth is the empath. We're feeling everyone else's feelings, but we don't really know how we feel because we're just too busy doing that. Or the sixth is somatizing. Our emotions are manifesting as physical symptoms.
Genius framework. That's very, very good. There's some things in there that are quite surprising. And I can see my mind's drawing little threads between, like, if you grow up and you are using one of the other strategies, then your body is going to be like, it's going to have to become a back pain because you're not getting it, and or the emotion's got nowhere to go. And so it's going to your lower back or it's going to your stomach or wherever. I can see there's little threads that could tie some of those things together. That's fascinating. So the big question people are going to be asking is, yeah, I'm doing it. What do I do now? What's the answer?
The answer is to stop doing it.
how can people, after potentially decades of doing the strategies, start to connect and feel their feelings when it's not necessarily the case for me, but it is the case for a lot of people? They feel like they're literally going to die of overwhelm if they even open the lid on that pain, suffering, anger, whatever it is. It's too much. They say it's too much. So there's going to be varying degrees. There's going to be people that maybe they can connect and feel their emotions on their own. Maybe not. Maybe they need to be seeing someone who can like hold space for them to go through that. Can you?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to go gently and to honor the resistance. So rather than seeing that defensiveness or that fear as a dysfunction to be gotten rid of, see it as the intelligence that has protected you and kept you safe. And to reiterate the point I made earlier, the walls that kept us safe as a child can become the prison as an adult. And so it's not trying to get a kind of wrecking ball and just destroy all of those walls, but it's really recognizing, do these patterns truly serve me at this point in my life? Because as a child, going back to the three emotional needs of love, safety, and boundaries, as a child, we are dependent upon someone else to give those to us. As an adult, we can learn to give those to ourselves.
Mm.
We can learn to hold space for ourselves. That's changing our relationship to our feelings and emotions. So for example, let's say we have a feeling of anger that comes up. We feel irritated about something. And our tendency is to go into analysis, to go, oh, they didn't mean it. Oh, it's okay. And oh, I should really do this. And I'm probably just angry because I haven't had enough to eat. I'm hangry, not angry. Like, we start to sort of diminish the feeling we have. And in that moment, we go, hang on. Alex talked about this in that interview that I watched. I can see I'm doing that. And I have this phrase that if you can see it, you don't have to be it. If you can recognize that's what you're doing, in that moment, you have a bit of a choice. Now, the choice is not to go, right, I'm just going to, in this moment, feel all the anger I've never felt in my life. That in of itself would be a pattern of pushing oneself, which may be, often we're traumatized by people that are too harsh in the ways they treat us. So one thing that we know is we're not going to heal the wound in the way it was created. Mm-hmm. So by being harsh with yourself in your healing, you're just recreating, perpetuating the same cycle. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I say to people is, even if you have strategies and tools that aren't very good, if the way you apply them is skillful, if you are very gentle, you're very attentive to your feelings, you're welcoming, you respect your defensiveness, that attitude in of itself will change things, even if you're not using the best methodologies in terms of emotional healing. So firstly, just shifting our attitude, being welcoming, being curious, being gentle, exploring, that in of itself will help. The next thing is that, what does a healthy emotional life look like? A healthy emotional life is not never getting angry, never feeling sad, never being frustrated. Like, I think there's lots of great things that have come out of popular psychology in recent years. But I think one of the things that concerns me is this idea that there are positive emotions and there are negative emotions. And negative emotions would be things like hate, anger, sadness, disappointment, whatever. But how I look at it is they're all just different energies that have different gifts and have different challenges. The energetic quality behind the ability to say no, to have a boundary. One of the things often we didn't have as children, we didn't know how to do, the energetic quality behind that is anger. It's the strength to go, you've crossed my boundary. The answer is no. And being able to do that, not in a reactive way or in a violent way, but just being able to feel, I feel a violation of my boundary and I'm going to hold it and I'm going to say no to that. So I think we also have to understand that you can't close your heart selectively. And what I mean by that is, if you close your heart to sadness, you're closing your heart to your ability to truly feel love. Because the price of love is often at some point sadness, because the person or the thing that we love may not be there forever and may not be in that kind of relationship forever. So if we're truly going to love, we have to risk sadness. If we shut sadness off, we're also limiting our capacity to truly feel love. So it's recognizing that all emotions have a place, and a healthy emotional life is like waves in an ocean. Sometimes there's a big wave of anger that might move through us. The next time there's a wave of sadness. But if we haven't got this massive backlog of all this stuff that we're carrying around, that, we're driving around the roundabout and then someone cuts us up and we've got 50 years of not feeling seen, and someone doesn't see us on the road and we suddenly want to murder them because there's a really deep wound that's just been triggered. The more we heal the history, the less triggered we become, and the more we can just have a rich and alive emotional life. I want to be really clear. My point is not that we should throw our emotion. I'm not saying have your anger means you throw it at people. It's having the feeling of it and realizing the potential in the feeling of it. So it's learning, it's shifting our attitude, and it's learning to open to our emotions in different ways. There are then various different methodologies that one can use to learn to feel their emotions. Part of it is it's simple but not easy. As simple as just learning to feel. Like, how do I feel right now? One of the exercises that I often use with people therapeutically is what do you feel right now? And then how do you feel towards how you feel? So how I feel right now is I feel sad. How do you feel towards it that I shouldn't feel that way, or it's not okay to be? So by shifting that relationship towards how we feel, often that in of itself will allow those feelings to start to open and start to move. And I just want to briefly complete a story. I'm mindful I'm probably taking up too much time here, but just I want to complete a story.
You're taking up too much time. Your wisdom is welcome.
So I mentioned about the experience of my father. So that the kind of completion of that story is about 8 years ago. I just reached this moment. I was like, I had one child, second child on the way. I was like, something feels incomplete in my soul. I need to sit in the presence of my father. I don't know what that means. I don't know what, I just need to have very clear sense to have that experience. And having tried to find him a few times previously, I actually managed to track down my father. I went and I met my father. And initially it was like the perfect, like Hollywood, like, I mean, his life was a complete disaster in lots of ways, but in that moment, like there was, in my heart, there was forgiveness. In his heart, there was apology and sincerity. And then some months passed, we were in this sort of bubble together. And then what basically became true was that he was saying all the right things, but it wasn't really based upon substance, that he knew the person I wanted him to be, and he was becoming that, and I wanted him to be that. And then we had, let's say, a more honest conversation where I challenged him on a few things. And we were out of this state restaurant in London. We were on the tube saying goodbye. And his passing words were, "Thank you, son, for the steak," which was almost as raw as the conversation. And I thought he was joking, but actually it was bruised. And he basically abandoned me again. He stopped answering my emails. He disappeared. And I have never felt a rage like the rage that I felt at that time. But I was able to feel it. I was able to allow myself to have that feeling. At one point, I got pretty close to getting in the car and going and probably trying to kill him, but I was able to just sit with the desire for that, not the action on that. And I wasn't, the point is, the second time, I wasn't traumatized. I was rageful, I was angry, I was hurt, but I wasn't traumatized. And he passed away last year, and I went to his funeral, and I felt at peace. I felt clear with the man, despite the history and the events and the things that have happened. So that the point that I really want to convey to people is that healing our emotions and healing our trauma is not about having everything neatly packed away in a box and being a sort of having a perfectly neat emotional life. It's often raw, it's gritty, it's difficult, but the potential is that we have a life of emotional freedom, a life of emotional openness, and that we can go through very painful experiences and not ultimately be traumatized by them.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing your personal story, because, well, one, it's very generous of you to share your personal story because it's very personal, it's very real, it's very raw. And second of all, because the demonstration in that is that that's an extremely painful, potentially re-traumatizing event. But what I'm hearing is it wasn't traumatizing for you because you allowed yourself to feel your feelings, not wrong them, not avoid them, not distract, not analyze, just feel them and acknowledge and process them, right? And
yeah, it's a very simple point I'm trying to make. It's just a really hard thing to do.
It's a really hard thing to do. And I agree with your earlier comment about popular psychology and all that jazz, about we should be happy and we should be this and we should be that and everything should be neat, and it's just like so much BS, because it's not, and we're human, and it's messy and it's loud and it's big and it's colorful and it's painful and it's magic and it's tragic and it's all of the things all together, right? And I think there's a lot of people shaming and judging themselves having difficult feelings. And I don't know about you, but I'm long time on this journey just for personal interest, but also for the work. And there's sadness and there's grief and there's regret and there's anger sometimes, and there's some rage comes up sometimes, and it's just like, well, this is human. You know, the ability to love yourself anyway and hold space.
Do you know what, B? It's funny, yesterday after work, I do this YouTube show where we film real life therapy sessions of me working with people and turn it into these episodes on YouTube, which I love doing. It's my very expensive hobby, basically, which I really love to do. But I filmed 3 episodes yesterday afternoon. I thought they were really good sessions, really good episodes. We did some really good work. and I'm driving home and it's kind of, it's like 8 o'clock in the evening. It's been a really long day. And I've got an electric car, and the car charger near the office is not working, and I've got like 10 miles of charge left. You can't plug electric cars in London you can't run cables over the pavement. And I'm going away with my wife for a couple of days tomorrow, and I get home and the charge around the corner from the house is not working. And I really pissed off. It's like, and I got home, my wife was like, I was in a foul mood, but I was in a foul mood for 5 minutes because I was pissed off, and I acknowledged I was pissed off. I didn't hide the fact I was pissed off. My kids knew I was pissed off. I wasn't taking it out on anyone. I wasn't reacting. I wasn't being cruel to anyone. I was just pissed off. But letting myself be pissed off, I was able to let it go. I then had a lovely evening of my eldest daughter watching Harry Potter 7. And it's like, but the point is, being emotionally open doesn't mean that you don't feel things. It just means that you don't get stuck in those places.
Yeah, you're not parking up and setting up camp and feeling, and well, it's a conscious being pissed off as opposed to
exactly.
Being pissed off.
Exactly.
Aren't we evolved?
Exactly.
I love it. So now the goodies. How can people, we're going to release this at a time when you are running something very special. So can you share a little bit about the event that's happening?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm a bit of an obsessive of learning. I love entering other people's ideas and worlds. I feel like as a practitioner, I grow so much through it, but I also feel in my own life, I get so much through it. And so one of the real joys of my life is producing and hosting these online conferences where we go really deep into an area. We've done a couple on fatigue, we've done one on relationships, and we're just about to release our second conference on trauma. And so there's over 70 interviews as part of this. People like Dr. Gabor Mate, Dr. Peter Levine, Dr. Stephen Porges, Thomas Hubel, and myself and the two other co-hosts they're some of the best interviews I think we've ever done. And it's a really great, if people have been touched in any way by what I've been talking about, my ideas have been shaped by so many of these people. So hearing these people share their wisdom in practical ways. There's also some film therapy sessions as part of this, some guided meditation. So it's really like going to the dream trauma event in person, but from the comfort of your own home. And it's completely free for the 7 days of the event. So each day there's about 10 interviews, there's a guided meditation, there's a film therapy session, and you can register with your email and you get free access. If you want to buy lifetime access to recordings, you can do, there's a small cost for that. But if you want to follow each day, it's completely free to do that. And it's a good one. That's some really, really good interviews, and really good practical takeaway stuff people can use.
Perfect. So we're going to have a link with this video. People can sign up now, and it's going to be starting, if you're watching this when it's first starts, it's going to be starting very soon. So the link with the video, if you miss it, you can still get access. You might just have to pay a small fee to get the access to it. But either way, the link with the video, get registered. I'm definitely going to register. I know friends and family members who will really benefit from this conference that you're offering as well. So thank you so much. I'm also going to put with this video links to your website, to your YouTubes, and therapy sessions so that people can connect in with that afterwards as well. I really appreciate your time, Alex.
Thank you, B. I really appreciate you having me. It's been a real joy to talk together.
Wonderful.